I'm really excited about today's panel. We have three excellent faculty members from Wake Forest who have worked with students in a myriad of different ways in the community. So I'm going to let them kind of talk about their own work and how they've worked with students, but I'll briefly introduce our panelists. So Sherry Lawson Clark is a faculty member in the anthropology department and has done quite a bit of work in community-based research, both on her own and working with students. Carrie Epps is a faculty member in the writing program and has worked with students in service learning, undergraduate students in service learning, but also advises a student organization that does community engaged work. And then John Sr. is in the Divinity School. John and I actually co-led a summer internship program 4 years ago, John. Is that how long ago? I think that's what it was.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, which
now, yeah.
Wild. That was Divinity School students and undergraduate students serving in the community for the full summer. But John works directly with the Divinity School students on their practicum work. So I appreciate those of you that were able to put in some questions. As is, typical of this space, I will try to make sure that those questions get asked if they don't get addressed on the front end by our panelists. And then we'll have a Q&A where you can ask any questions that you do have. So you don't have to put your questions in that Google form. It's just there in case that works better for what you have going on in life today. So without further ado, I will ask Dr. Lawson Clark to kick us off.
Well, great. And thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it. So I will just talk a little bit about my background in sort of service learning and working with community-based organizations, et cetera. And so when I first came to Wake in my first 3-4 years, maybe, I oversaw the at the time, Women's and Gender Studies internship program, where I placed all WGS students who were minoring at that time. It was a program in WGS with community organizations. And so I can talk a little bit about that research. And that during that time, at the end of my 3-year tenure, I directed the community something CCC, which was a service community-based organization for faculty who wanted to do community-based participatory research. And so I could speak on both sides, both the faculty side and student side, but I want to start with the student side, and that the internship, even though it was an internship, sort of the difference, I think we need to clarify the difference between an internship and volunteerism. And so just I'm sending students out and connecting with organizations. I was very much interested in sort of the internship being a scholarship, and so not just placing students to do sort of clerical work. It needed to be around the studies of women's and gender studies. And so these organizations I had worked with in gathering them over a course of 2 or 3 years. And so I had a database of organizations that related to either the study of women or gender, and were interested in having students come in and learn about their organizations. So students had a threefold opportunity. They could go in and they could do direct service with the organization. They could do some sort of volunteer type work, or they could do research based on the content of the actual organization. And so the internships were geared toward where the students wanted to do, but also very much closely working with the organization. And so one of the, I think, tips I have for faculty is to be certain about what your objectives are as you send students out, and what is the purpose. And first and foremost, to physically, or now we're on Zoom, to be in contact with the organization the entire time. And I very rarely just sent students out. I did service visits, site visits the entire semester wherever my students were placed. And I think that relationship, building that relationship with the community is vital to the success. It's not just for the success of your particular course or program, but I think the relationship that Wake Forest has with the broader Winston-Salem community. And that is something that needs to continue to be fostered and built upon. And the work that I do for my own research within the community, I find this as also vital in that, you know, my approach or our approach needs to be from what can we learn from you, the organization, the community, what is it that you need, as opposed to, I have this research interests as a faculty member and I want it to be served. I have a research question I want to be answered. That is not sort of the approach that we take. And I will guarantee you that any research question you have can be answered, but it cannot be sort of, you can't go into the community with that approach. And so I think relationship building, understanding sort of the purpose, what is it that you want to get out of the contact with the community, but also making sure you are being really good stewards. And so ethical, you know, moral, all of that sort of going into one of the other things that, this is the last thing I say, one of the things that I also came to mind, and this is in all my community work that I've done, not just here, but throughout the United States, is that, you know, especially if you're working with marginalized communities, that and coming from an institution like Wake Forest, so those understanding those power dynamics, and that what individuals see when they hear Wake Forest University, and that has to be acknowledged, not just by students, but faculty as well. And so those relationships, people expect the university to come in, take what it needs, and to leave. And I think we need to work as hard as we can to sort of counter that narrative. And the way in which we do that is to be present and stay present. So that's all. Thanks.
Thanks for that wonderful, wonderful opening, Dr. Lawson Clark. So, Dr. Epps, if you will take the next turn, that would be great. I'm going in order of who's showing up on my screen.
That works. So I do have a 3.5-month-old baby sleeping right beside me, and he could wake up at any moment. So I'm going to try to make my spiel as concise as possible. I'm on maternity leave, for those of you who don't know. Ryan, good to see you. I haven't seen you in quite a while. But this is really nice to be invited because I am still, even though I am on leave this term, still working really closely with the nonprofit Authoring Action, which I'm happy to talk a little bit about. But like Shelley said, I mean, my community engagement work has been in a number of different areas with students. First, I teach a Writing 111 seminar that's called Exploring Community Writing. And that course has just been a work in progress ever since I got here. It was one of the very first things that I had Shelley's input on in 2018 when I got to Wake Forest. So still working on that. I think one of the challenges with that course is that that Writing 111 is a required course. And even though students do have some agency in choosing the theme, a lot of them show up in class on the first day having no idea that it has a theme. And so I think with those introductory courses, like I would just welcome a conversation about that, because I do think it is very challenging, especially for first semester freshman students to get involved in community engagement work in a classroom. because they're so new to campus and just really want to explore that community. So I've still been working with that. I think some of the most successful work that I've done has been with Wake Women Lead, which is the student organization that Shelley was talking about. Wake Women Lead started off predominantly working with the nonprofit Lead Girls of North Carolina. And now they have broadened their outreach and are working with school and trying to incorporate a new program. They've also done, some of them have done trainings with Authoring Action as well. So they've kind of broadened their scope a little bit. And then most recently, I've done a community listening accountability group with those undergraduate students. It was a very small group of about 5 undergraduate students who did a summer workshop series with me and with Rowie Kirby Straker, who I think you heard from last time. And we are working primarily with Authoring Action with that accountability group. So I think that particular group just kind of came about after I'd started reading some recent scholarship on community listening, and was just really fascinated by thinking about listening preparation. And I kind of glanced at the document with some of the questions. And I think that introducing some of at least the main tenets of that scholarship to undergraduate students is actually probably really helpful. And I hope to do that in my future courses. But I also sorry, I'm all over the place. I'm just trying to touch base on a lot of the questions before this little one wakes up. But there was a question, I believe, about just maybe readings or something like that that you share with undergraduate students, or maybe preparation for emailing and communicating with community partners. I do have an article called Students in the Streets. It's from someone who's in rhetoric and composition. And she, in that piece, actually shares some of the emails gone wrong that undergraduate and graduate students have sent to community partners. And I actually do assign that to even 111 students, and they seem to be pretty horrified, actually, which is, good to see that they analyze those emails and actually do see, that there are some real ethical issues with that communication. So I'm happy to share that resource with anyone, and also happy to answer any follow-up questions to anything that I've introduced. So thank you for listening to my rambling.
Thank you so much. John.
Yeah, it's good to be with all of you. I'm John Senior. I coordinate the field education program in the School of Divinity. Field education is sort of a standard part of Master of Divinity programs generally. So our students complete 2 200-hour ministry internship placements in congregations, nonprofit organizations, chaplaincy settings of various kinds, and increasingly in settings that are not sort of traditional for religious leadership, like activist settings, agricultural settings, and other spaces. So one of the gifts and challenges of being a theological educator right now is that the institutions that we have traditionally prepared leaders for are changing. They're dying in many cases, but they're also changing. And so that means the leadership frame that we're using needs to change too. And that's reflected in the internship program. So unlike, I think, some of the courses you're talking about, the internship courses I teach are not framed by a common theme. And that's actually one of the conditions that make it both interesting and challenging pedagogically, to figure out how to get students who are in different contexts, serving in different contexts, with different vocational goals, different learning outcomes, to be able to process their experiences together in a common way that's productive. And so we have a course component that runs concurrent with the internship placements, where we do a number of different exercises, but the main exercise is a case study method where students take turns presenting case studies from their internship work. We have a particular way that they write those, and then a particular way that that the peer group works together to process those with the goal of kind of in the action, reflection, action model to surface wisdom and insight from the internship work that the students are doing, with the hope that that would then inform not only their continuing work in their internship settings, but also the other students in the peer groups continuing work in their internship settings too. I would just underscore 2 points that Sherry made. One is the piece about Wake Forest. I certainly find that although faith communities are sometimes used to this format because their own ministers did it when they were in seminary, it's also true that we have to be aware of the university's track record with the community and how that shapes the way that they respond to this opportunity. And the other piece that Sherry mentioned that resonated with me was about the need to kind of have a way to help students to identify what their learning goals are in very concrete ways. We have students to write pretty extensive learning plans at the beginning of their internship placements. And often what I learned in my first couple of years is that often what happens is that they promptly forget about what their goals were. And then at the end of the semester, at the end of the summer or academic year, you know, they have to pull these things back out and then wonder if they actually achieved the goals that they set out for themselves. So I've had to, you know, reframe that process in a way that they're continually paying attention to the learning outcomes that they develop for themselves. And again, since they're all working in different spaces with different career goals in mind, we don't have shared learning outcomes for the class per se, except in a very general sense. So that's a little bit about that. And what I'm imagining is that the work that I'm doing isn't quite like what you all are interested in, but I'm hoping that I can leverage some of that experience to help you think about the kinds of courses you'd like to teach.
Thanks to each of you. So I think the first question that we have just to start us off is, as you think about kind of students that you've worked with, things that went well, didn't go well, how did you prepare students to enter that space, and what would you do different? Or what would you advise that these folks make sure to do to prepare students to enter community?
I can start off with, I am a trained cultural anthropologist, so culture is very important to me, and understanding what culture is and what culture is not. And so I start out those courses in just the basics, and where there are many theoretical perspectives about what is culture, but I like Clifford Geertz's work, which looks at sort of symbolism and semiotics, and thinking about culture as sort of this thick description and how we differentiate between thick description and thin description. And it gets students to really hone in on their cultural biases and how they understand. So I go through, what is anthropocentrism, what is naive realism, and going through culture shock, all of those things that they are likely to be presented with when they go into work in the community with groups that are not their own, or they may be or they may not be, but I want them to be as culturally sensitive as possible. So I do build heavily in the beginning of the semester on readings, and we do some sort of role playing and various activities before they enter. And as I mentioned before about those relationships, I require students to do an interview with the organization. And so that's twofold. One, the organization has to accept the student in, and so that they want them to be there, but also students also get a sense to interview the organization and find out what their what their overall mission is this a good workspace for me? So I want it to be mutually compatible, because the idea is that they need to show up and they need to be there on time and doing the things that they are required to do. But the entire time, there are reflections, there are weekly blog posts, or however you center it, like what is it that they're experiencing? And they're keeping this sort of portfolio. I started, I think, at the end of doing this, e-portfolios, where students are keeping all this information so that as they matriculate through the end of the semester, they have this information, because they do have a final paper that they have to write based on their internship experience. And then they have various papers throughout, because I want them to constantly think about not just the work that they're doing, but how does it relate to the scholarship, right? And so bringing sort of the theoretical perspectives into sort of practice, which makes it praxis, and having it be a full sort of course in that way. So.
I really appreciate that, Sherry. And I think I have a question I want to come back to for you in just a bit. My time is very limited at the moment. I see eyeballs. So I just wanted to say that even in that introductory course, the 111, I've started incorporating more of the scholarship around community engagement. Like I said, I used the students in the streets piece. And then I also, this past semester, introduced this new scholarship on rhetorical empathy that I'm really interested in. And I mean, I didn't have the students read that scholarship because I think it's a little bit difficult for introductory students, but it's a really interesting concept in terms of thinking about how we view the audience to whom we're speaking. And it really related to community engagement work really well, I thought. So I've been using some of that scholarship, but I definitely have a lot to rework still, especially in that introductory class. And another thing that I was going to say is that I have, and this is more of a challenge, I guess. So I don't know if I'm really sharing things that are working all that well, or just introducing things that this group could maybe talk about. But in those early classes, especially the required course like Writing 111, I've really struggled with students just trying to work with community partners to get a good grade. And so incentivizing students, again, who are in that course and who are taking it just to fulfill the requirement, even though it has this community engaged label attached to it, that has been really, really challenging. In some of the other courses, like the 300 level courses, I think it would be easier. I'm still trying to make a 300 level community engaged course for the writing program. But I just struggle with that. I struggle with the requirement part, and like, how do we prepare students to enter into these ethical, reciprocal relationships when at the end of the day, they may just want the grade. So that is what I have really struggled with, and I'm continuing to work on.
The main thing that our students do at the beginning of any internship placement is a pretty extensive context analysis. In the past, it's been papers, but I think the pandemic experience has taught me how to broaden my way of thinking about the media in which these things can be done. So now they do them in different formats, but they have to analyze the context in which they'll be working along a number of lines in terms of demographics and history of the context, the socioeconomic conditions of the context, and so on. And then they have to present that to their peer group. And that's important because as they do case studies later on, it's helpful for the other students to have some sense of the space in which each student is working. And then also at the beginning of the internship work, when students write learning plans, part of what that is about is kind of negotiating with the internship setting so that the student is doing some of the things that the internship setting would like for a student to do, and the student is also learning things that the student would like to learn. And so in that process, I think they get that process itself generates some awareness about the context and what the congregation really needs and so on. So those would be the two main pieces that we have to help students orient themselves to their internship settings.
So another question that I see kind of popping up on the Google Doc was around this balance between, which I think actually Carrie alluded to a little bit in talking about the challenges with first year students, but just how you strike a balance in scoping projects for students and knowing kind of the not giving them too much, but giving them enough. I would say that can both apply to work and apply to knowledge, skills, right? Emotional abilities to operate in a space. So what do y'all think about that? How do you balance that in thinking about the work that students will do?
I think one of the things that that can be done is the WGS internship, for example. There was students could take a 1.5 credit or a 3 credit. And so that the difference was the amount of time they spent each week at the organization. And for some, for the minor requirements, because it was a required course, they had to have 3 credits. But the good thing about that for students who said 1.5 is that they could narrow that time for 1 semester and then pick up another organization or continue with the organization the second semester or a second semester. So that was one way to scale it for students. I think also scaling it around what they did. And so for students who are interested in program management, like how do you manage an organization, they would focus on that, or they were interested in sort of the actual research of the organization, of what the organization was doing. That was an area, or direct services. So depending on what students like, so they had buy-in, which I think helped them sort of, want to be there and want to be more engaged. And it gave them some sort of efficacy around sort of their independence. But I think it's to be scaled. I didn't take away any of the writings because I do think that students need to write and they need to reflect. And Bell Hooks has a very small article that I assign at the beginning of the semester, sort of out of the academy and into the streets, that I think really help students think about and reflect on the kind of work that they will be entering in. Because it's very much, I think the internship is not just what they're doing for the community, but what they find out about themselves in doing that work. And so that's important.
I think too that this past semester, I just had a couple of community partners who I had formed really strong relationships with in the past, and they kind of came up with some projects that were appropriate for the first year's writing students, and kind of having that structure already in place and those relationships already established, rather than just kind of sending the students out. And I understand it's probably a lot different in the internship structure, but for first year students, I certainly did not want to just send them out to like form these relationships in 1 semester and try to do a project. I've done something a little too much like that before, and it was not super successful. So I think that having those couple of project ideas that the students could just kind of step into and work either individually or as groups, whatever, you as the instructor think fits best with the course learning goals and outcomes. I think that worked a lot better, especially for my class.
Our internship placements are typically framed around the kind of the basic leadership competencies that are relevant in a particular setting. So for example, if a student is working in a congregation, the idea would be for them to at least encounter all of the main leadership practices that are relevant for congregations: preaching and worship, pastoral care, religious education, program administration, so on. Usually what ends up happening is that the student has kind of a focal point where they focus most of their time and energy, and then they do some work in the other areas. For example, they might be involved in the youth ministry program, and that's sort of the main thing that they're doing, but then they preach a couple of times and they do some of the pastoral care and so on. But it is a challenge to get every year to help students to get the 100 hours per semester of internship work to coincide with the stuff they're promising to do in their learning plans. So sometimes they get very ambitious, and they and their supervisor mentors identify all of these things that they're going to do, and they're all really good things, but they would consume way more than 100 hours. So part of my job is to help them to try to set realistic goals, so that they're not spending all of their time in their internship work. And throughout the semester, as they do regular reflection assignments, they report on their progress on their learning goals, which is again a way of kind of connecting the learning plan at the beginning of the year to the assessments that come at the end of each semester, so that they're always paying attention to their progress on the goals they set for themselves. And that helps me to know too how well their plan is fitting to the time commitment that they have to the internship setting. And sometimes we have to make adjustments about that. Usually in January, when they come back from winter break, they have an opportunity to revise their learning goals as things shift in their internship settings. And so again, our internships are not typically project centered, except for the summer of 2019, 3 years ago, when Shelley and I worked together on the summer internship program. That was kind of a new experience for me in structuring internship placements around projects that had certain were intended to have certain deliverables by the end of the summer, rather than structuring it around a set of leadership practices. So one of my goals is to come back to that format and try that again sometime.
So the last question that I have, and then we'll just open it up to questions that have come up for you in this conversation, is, so I would like to name that you can do everything right as the faculty member. You can build a relationship, you can assign the appropriate readings, you can scope it well. Students can still drop the ball. They can still operate out of a place of bias. They can still maybe misrepresent the relationship that they're having. So talk to us about what you all have done that you feel has been successful in addressing those issues kind of when they arise. Or even things that you don't, maybe you say, I tried this thing and it actually didn't work. I thought it would work, but it didn't. I certainly have plenty of those. So what do you do when it goes awry?
Wow. I will say, I'm just like reflecting back on the occasions. I have pulled students from internships, and that this is not working. And they had to figure out other ways to obtain or gain that credit. But for me, it was not, or good for them, it was not good for the organization or the community. So in that case, it's just like, are there other things that you can do? Are there other practicums? And so for a student, they had to work out, or we worked out, the department worked out alternatives. But that's like, I think, the worst case scenario. But I do think sort of the continuous sort of feedback. And so there was not, a week that went by where I did not know what students were doing, sort of just checking in. I think that constant checking in and keeping track, visiting sites, I think were also really helpful. One of the things that I did as a faculty member, wrote a grant to become an evaluator for a community-based organization. So it's 5 community organizations coming together with a program working in the Boston Thurman neighborhood. I'm sure some of you might be familiar with. And that was a 3-year project. And I utilized students that were in my Roots of Racism class, had been trained in ethnographic interviewing, to go in with each of the executive directors and interview them on a list of questions. And so these answers would help them in their group projects, but it also helped the overall sort of evaluation of the study that I was doing in the field, which then went back to the organizations that they could use. And so one of the things I did want to mention is that all organizations have to fundraise. And in order to fundraise, they have to submit reports every year, annual reports about what they have, how they have used their monies. And I will tell you, all of the research that I have done with community groups, that research report that I have written up has gone back to those organizations, and they have used that in their sort of annual reports. And so any ways in which you as faculty members can help organizations, whether it's grant writing or reports, policy reports that you can give back to organizations, they are open arms. And so one of the things with the interviews that the students did with all 5 organizations, they loved these students coming in and asking these questions. And they were about hour and a half interviews that they did. And they were like, they wrote up their results and sent them back to the organizations. And they were like super, super grateful and thankful for, that part of it. So any ways in which you could do that, I think is a mutual thing. I had many, many more successes than I had failures, but I think that one of the ways to decrease those sort of failures is that constant contact.
I will say that even I saw a question on the Google Doc about like how much you supervise and everything. I think that's key. I mean, trying to be as on top of all of that communication and like making sure that the organization is happy and things like that is really important. I still think that in my experience, just fairly recently, as much as I thought things were going well, there were still some student behaviors that kind of slipped through the cracks and actually got shared with me by other students. And that to me was really helpful. And ultimately it is kind of like what you were saying, Sherry, like the student was just not invited back. Like there was just some kind of conversations that I had with the other students, and we decided that was the best thing to do. But it's really hard to know what's going on, especially in the instructor role, because I think we do see a lot of that performative behavior. And, again, I'm going back to like a required course, and, this is not an internship program. So I found it really difficult, even though I try to, be really vigilant. It has been difficult to kind of keep tabs on what is really going on. But I think the good thing is that other students are trying to look out for the organization and the people that they serve. I found that to be really helpful and refreshing. So yeah, I don't think that's really an answer, but I mean, I did recently go through something that was kind of traumatizing to me as an instructor, because I was so upset that this student had behaved the way that he did. So still definitely a lot to learn about how to handle those situations. But I think from my perspective, I've seen a lot more good than bad. But I know I don't know that everything that's going on.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, I hadn't really thought of this before in quite this way, but there's sort of a spectrum, I guess, of of conditions that that are possible when internships go sideways. On one side is the organization, for whatever reason, failing to provide the opportunities that they said they would provide, and there are different reasons why that might be the case. And then on the other side would be the student failing to to show up in the internship in the way that they're supposed to. And there are lots of reasons. There's some reasons there too. I think more often than not, though, it's somewhere in the middle where there's like a misalignment of some kind, that the student is feeling like they're not doing quite the work that they want to do, or the organization feels like the student isn't plugging in quite the way they were expecting. And in those situations, to the extent that it's appropriate, I try to position students to kind of lean into that conflict, because it is a leadership practice that we want them to learn as to how to deal with conflict. When those situations shade on the side of the organization failing to do what it's supposed to be doing, then I think more often than not, I'm more involved in that kind of situation, to be in touch with the organization about that, whatever the problem is. Sometimes something that comes up a lot is that organizations will, students end up doing a lot more like busy work than kind of leadership work in the space. And so, sometimes there need to be conversations about the work that they're doing. And on the other side, I would say in general, when our students are in academic trouble, it's mostly because they're overcommitted. They have family obligations, work obligations, school obligations, internship obligations, and they're having a hard time balancing all of those. And so I have to work with students on occasionally to help them sort that out. So there's sort of a spectrum, and I try to judge when it's appropriate for me to be involved, but I also try to position the students to the extent that it's appropriate to try to address the problems on their own.
Thank you all. I would like to open it up for questions that have come up for you in the last 45 minutes, our last 15 minutes on the call. Who has questions or comments? Go ahead, Ryan, and then Lauren. Sorry, Lauren, I didn't see yours.
I think Lauren was before me, actually.
I'm looking mostly at having Wake students work with children in the community. I'm wondering if any of you have experience with that, or any special considerations or advice for preparing Wake students to work with kids.
They're generally pretty excited about that. This last semester was the first time I'd actually gotten to see them work directly with children. I think for the most part, and I was kind of working with the student organization that I advise, Wake Women Lead, and connecting that with my class. So there were all kinds of crazy complications, but I know that, there are some like protection of minors trainings and stuff that like the OCCE does that you want to make sure the students do beforehand. But for the most part, I thought that the students did pretty well in that environment and had a lot of fun. This is my little partner right now. This is my little kid. But it was such a short time frame though, Lauren, that I can't say for sure like what I would do differently. I would have to really think about that. But I do think that Wake students are generally really enthusiastic about it. But making sure that it's not that they're just like, oh, I just want to go play with kids, and also do have like some of that good preparatory work in order to do that in a way that, it is, again, ethical. That word I just keep coming back to.
I put in the chat Camry Wilborn's contact information in our office, because Camry does a lot of work. She basically leads all of our strategy around education, K-12 education, but also does the protection of minors. The other resource I'll mention just for you, Lauren, a book that I like is Lisa Delpit's Other People's Children. It was initially written, she is a Black educator, and she was writing it about predominantly white women teachers in environments, in school environments that were predominantly kids of color. But I find that it's a really useful text for white students that are thinking about doing work with non-white kids in the community. Now, it's not the only text you're going to want to have, because there will be, non-white students in your class. So you don't want to presume that everybody's coming from a racial privileged place, but it's helpful, and it's written kind of like narrative-y, even though she's a qualitative researcher.
That's perfect. Thanks.
You're up, Ryan.
Okay, I was just making sure no one else had something to offer to that. That's really helpful. Thank you all. I really appreciate all the insight you all shared. I guess the question I have is maybe it's a little too conceptual. Maybe not. I've been thinking a lot, maybe just because of what I've been teaching in my courses, about the kind of role that what sometimes gets called the hidden curriculum plays in sort of shaping students' understanding both of kind of their place in the world, about like where other communities fit, and not even necessarily in like an actively quote unquote sort of negative way, but even like just models of like community involvement or volunteerism, or mission trips or things that they might have done, where they're like the relationship between groups of people is figured or structured in certain ways. And I'm just kind of wondering, like, are there, I mean, I think a number of you've spoken to some of the things you've tried to bring in terms of conversation. Like, where do you see some of the fault lines or difficult, the kind of speed bumps or roadblocks, even for like well-intentioned students who may be holding quite tightly to some previously held ideas about like what it means to do service, or they're going from your classroom or into a context where like a student org is doing like a really weird and specific kind of thing that is a completely different way of figuring a relationship between the campus and the community. So I know that's like a really weird conceptual thing. I'm really thinking about how the different ways I hear students talk about the kinds of work they do, and how different some of the work they're doing in these more structured, OCCE sponsored and community engaged classroom kind of things, than like the kinds of stuff I hear them talking about when they're talking about like, the stuff that student orgs do. So I don't know, take that, if you can say something about that, or you can ignore that and just feel that as like a mild rant, which is probably what it really is. But let's pretend it's a question. Thank you.
Ryan, I'm glad you said that, because I was trying to think of a time to insert this particular scholar, and I think she works here. So Tania Mitchell is a scholar that does a lot of critical service learning scholarship, and she has a piece that I think is particularly helpful called Service Learning as a Pedagogy of Whiteness, and it really talks about what you just named, and also starts to really critique that as like doing service is just a good thing. And so I've actually assigned that before and said like, hey, this class is a service learning class and you signed up for it. So we're going to read this critique of the thing you signed up for and talk about if you still are glad you signed up, right? Like, so I think that can be helpful. The other piece that I've assigned that's like not as scholarly is Teju Cole has a shorter piece called The White Savior Industrial Complex. That's a critique of like Tom Shoes, and it's actually a critique of Coney 2020, whatever year it was, that like the kids now are way too young to even remember. And so it's a helpful critique because they don't feel like they're being critiqued. They feel like they're reading this thing about these dummies in the past. And then you get to be like, oh, but how is this similar to like this fundraiser that you're doing for just the continent of Africa, right? So those are two that I would recommend just to read, but I think the other one is even better. And yes, I've been making notes the whole time because this one, there's been a lot more citations than the first. So I'm just gonna make a little Google Doc, and we'll just create a running kind of citation list.
And I'd add to the citation list, Butin's, B-U-T-I-N, it's conceptualizing service learning, and there's a specific part in there where he talks about sort of drive-by volunteerism, which is really crucial. I think it speaks to what you were talking about, Ryan. So yeah, it's a good piece.
That's a great name for exactly what I was thinking about, Sherry. Yeah, that's exactly what I had in mind.
I have a piece too that I've assigned to students that does talk about the differences between like service learning, volunteerism, community engaged work, which I typically use some formulation of like community engaged teaching when I talk about what, our class is doing. And we do talk about, Ryan, like exactly what you said. Like we talk about, is this just a resume filler? Or, is it something that you just want to like say as a stamp of approval for yourself? Like I did something good. Or, is it really like reciprocal community engaged work? And we just have a conversation about that usually when I assign that very student-centered piece. And if anybody is teaching undergraduates, especially in the like freshman or sophomore years, I think that would be an appropriate piece. So I'm happy to add that to Shelley's list.
One of the challenges that pedagogical challenges that comes up in our internship program is that I think particularly with students who are working in congregations, it's hard for them to kind of transition from the orientation to that work as, I'm going to go in and do something for this community, to really the work of ministry in a congregation is sharing life with community, with a particular community, and attending to different aspects of that life where, good ministry can often look like that nothing in particular gets done in a in a given week. I mean, doesn't end up in some deliverable necessarily. And I think it's sometimes difficult to get students out of that way of thinking about things. We're always working with them to refine their critical self-awareness, critical context awareness, as they enter into these spaces. But it's also true that they're often in spaces with everyday people who themselves don't have great critical self-awareness or critical context awareness, and so that can generate tension as well. So there's a lot of complexity about that, and we try to help them to pay attention to that as they go along.
Well, I want to say thank you so much to our panelists. I think several people are having to drop off. I'm going to include you all in this citation Google Doc that I'm making, because it'd be great if it could just become something that's like open that we can share with folks that's running. as they're looking into doing more of this work. I also just want to note that I will be emailing you all today. We have our applications are open, nominations are open right now for our annual kind of awards through the office. And there is a faculty award that is under nominated. So if there are folks that you know that are your colleagues, if you want to nominate yourself, would be excited to see that. So I'll share that. And yes, just thank you so much to Sherry, Carrie, and John.
Shelly, if you want to create a folder to share too, I have some of those PDFs that I could just drop in. That might even be easier for some people.